Hey guys, it's Chris from Green Bench here. We are on Module 7 packaging. We're going to talk about carbonation. So yeah, let's hop into it, see what we got going on. There we go. So we're going to talk about beer carbonation. We're going to talk about carbonation levels, methods of carbonating, and the required reading for this slide in the Brewer's Handbook, Chapter 16, beer carbonation. So let's hop right in. Beer carbonation. What is it? Okay. Carbonation is a measured amount of the carbon dioxide in a suspended liquid. Carbonation in beer itself plays a major factor. It increases the body and mouthfeel, enhances the aroma, increases the shelf life of the product, because carbonated beer itself has a higher resistance to aerobic contamination, aerobic being in the presence of oxygen. So if you have a beer, for example, that's carbonated, any aerobic bacteria wouldn't live or survive in that environment. They wouldn't be there. So aerobic contamination kind of becomes almost non-existent in a carbonated product. Carbonation levels. So beer following primary fermentation has a dissolved CO2 level somewhere around 1.2 to 1.7 volumes of CO2 per volume of beer. So this is basically in an unpressurized fermentation. So you don't pressurize the fermentation, you're still going to have quite a bit of CO2 in solution, in suspension, post-fermentation. So the CO2 levels is going to depend on quite a few factors. You get your temperature, your pressure, turbidity, the vessel structure, and the yeast strain. So that number is 1.2 to 1.7. You got 0.5 difference there. Is going to be based upon all these other factors depending on what you have going on in your brewery. It's different in every brewery because there's different factors with every single beer, with every process in every brewery. Carbonation levels. So commonly, you're going to raise CO2 levels before packaging, unless it's like cask condition, then you don't do that. However, secondary fermented beers usually require more CO2 additions than primarily fermented beers. It depends on the style and brewery preference, but typically CO2 levels of packaged beer, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.7 volumes. Just traditionally speaking, most typical beer is going to be between there. However, it goes way higher than that, especially when you get to sort of Belgian beers and some German beers. For example, here's a small chart kind of detailing a few of these, and I guess I'm in the way there on some of those, but the German wheat actually goes all the way up to 4.5 in some beers. So does the Fruit Lambic. So, for example, British Ale is going to be your lowest, your cask conditioned beers, 1.5 to 2 volumes, pretty low, pretty standard, almost exactly what you're getting right out of a beer when it's finished fermenting. So it's essentially a still product. Porters and stouts, you're going a little bit higher, that 1.7 to 2.3, 2.4 range. Belgian ales tend to be a little bit higher. You're talking like your singles, your doubles, your triples. Those are going to be 2 to 2.4, 2.5. Once you get to sort of lager and American ales, you get a little bit higher. Pale ales are going to be probably about 2.4, 2.3, 2.5 around there. So your lager and American ales are going to be anywhere between 2.3 and 2.7. Lambic, which is also going to be probably 2.5-ish to upwards of even 3 sometimes. And your Fruit Lambic is going to be higher. And your Fruit Lambic, we can also probably bunch some of those Belgian beers like farmhouse ales, Brett beers, things like that in that Fruit Lambic category. Those are definitely going to be over 3 volumes almost always. At least they kind of should be based on style. You're usually going to see upwards of 3.6 to 4 volumes on a lot of those bottle conditioned beers. Saison, DuPont kind of characteristics, really champagne-y, big beers as far as carbonation levels. And then German wheats are definitely going to be high too. They're super, super carbonated, but the wheat in them, the turbidity is going to cut that a bit. All right, so the methods in which one would carbonate. So one way of doing it is secondary fermentation, beer that's transferred via counterpressure from primary fermenter to a secondary fermenter. At this point, the beer usually has about 1 Plato suspended sugar extract left in suspension. Usually you keep the beer temperature pretty low, about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the secondary tank, you set the pressure to about 12 to 15 psi. The remaining extract ferments out, carbonating the beer to a stable equilibrium. This takes a few days. So it takes a little bit. So you'll finish the beer, you move it to a second fermenter, set it to about 15 psi, put some pressure on it, close it, let the yeast just tear through it at that pressure, and then you have basically a carbonated product that's essentially kind of naturally carbonated somewhat. Not completely, obviously, you're doing set 15 psi, but you're allowing the yeast to kind of finish it off. Bottle conditioning. So this is when you take finished beer and you put it into a blending tank where you're going to add sugar, dextrose, honey, syrups, anything like that, and then you're going to add yeast, healthy yeast usually. You're still going to add probably a normal pitch rate, 1 million cells per degree Plato per ml, and the blend is then bottled, and you allow that blend to age and warm, usually between 55 Fahrenheit and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, where basically it undergoes a re-fermentation in the bottle. The yeast breaks down the sugar that you added, creates CO2 under pressure, and the CO2 production naturally carbonates the beer in each bottle separately. So each beer is somewhat different in its bottle conditioning characteristics. Very fascinating, old world, beautiful, I think, way of carbonating beers. We do a lot of bottle conditioning at our place because there's nothing like it, I think, when you drink a beer that's been naturally carbonated. Cask conditioning. You basically rack your primary fermented beer into a cask. You seal it roughly 2 Plato, wort around 2 million cells per ml. You store the cask cool, which is still, by the way, that number is still 1 million per degree Plato per ml. You store the cask cool, 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Let it warm enough to finish. Leave it warm enough to finish fermentation. The CO2 production naturally occurs in the beer, in the cask. We mentioned this in one of our previous slides in this this module. You essentially cap the cask, let it continue to ferment out, but again, based on that chart, you're still talking 1.5 to about 2 volumes of CO2, and natural beer that's finished in primary fermentation is usually between 1.2 and 1.7. So potentially it tastes and feels just as carbonated, or lack of carbonation rather, than you'd find in just a beer that was primarily fermented. Traditional. Forced carbonation. This is most widely used form of carbonation right now in the world. It requires bulk CO2, so you need a giant CO2 tank. Most breweries purchase bulk CO2 from gas suppliers that just show up and fill the tanks up. We do at our place as well. Some breweries will sometimes recover the CO2 during fermentation, which is an amazing and beautiful process. They'll essentially capture the CO2, purify it, liquefy it, and then store it for use in house. This is an extremely expensive setup, but it is really, really cool to be able to reuse your CO2 that you're just producing during fermentation in your brew house anyway. It can also be done in fermenter or in a bright tank, forced carbonation that is. So you can carbonate a beer either in the uni tank, the fermenter that you're using, or the bright tank that you can transfer to. Forced carbonation, we'll talk a little bit about inline carbonation. This is when you use a stainless steel sort of CO2 stone, and you inject the CO2 into the cold beer as it's being transferred to the bright beer tank. So basically, the beer arrives in the tank carbonated. There's usually a high cost for inline carbonators, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. You can still do it with a little bit relatively lower cost if you're using, for example, like a spundling valve. I know Coppertail in Tampa does this, where they'll actually, near the end of fermentation, they'll spundle the CO2 that's coming out of the fermenter. Essentially what that means is you set the gauge so the CO2 doesn't actually release until it gets to a certain pressure. So you're using the natural CO2 during fermentation to partially carbonate the beer. And then, so by the time they're ready to transfer to the bright tank, the beer's partially carbonated. And then in line, they just put a CO2 stone, inject CO2 over the liquid as it's going to the bright tank, and it's carbonated by the time it gets to the bright tank. It's pretty wild. This is what a CO2 stone looks like. Basically, there's a ton of tiny holes all around this thing. Like everything you're seeing, there's like little tiny holes. And so you hook CO2 up in here, you stick this into the tank, and it's submerged around the beer itself. And then you turn CO2 on, and it injects CO2 into the liquid itself. So forced carbonation, so in tank carbonation. So basically you use that same kind of stone we just showed you. So using a stainless steel CO2 stone, the CO2 is injected into the cold beer inside of the inside of the bright beer tank. The time it takes to carbonate the beer completely depends on a lot of factors. There's temperature, pressure, beer volume, and time. The temperature is going to greatly change. If it's warmer, temperature is going to take longer. If it's colder, it's going to be a lot faster. If there's pressure is super high or super low, that's going to change it. If the volume is lower, you'll be able to carbonate it faster. And if it's higher, you have a higher head pressure against the CO2 that you're adding. And then the time in which it takes. So for example, if you're going in, if you leave it on, the CO2 on for 20 hours, you can trickle it in at a lower volume, but you can still carbonate at the same level, for example, that if you put it in at 17 psi or 20 psi for 4 hours. So time is very important as well. The way that you test carbonation is usually brewers use this device. It's called a ZOM. Nagel is the name of the company. And essentially it just tests the carbonation levels. Basically what you do is you fill the device up, you hook this part up right here. You can't really see, I guess most of my head's in the way. You hook this device up here to the tank. You open this valve, you open the tank valve, and CO2 pours through this chamber up through here, and then you open this valve and it shoots out of here. You take this pressure gauge off and it shoots through. And you do that until straight beer comes out, and you close this, you close that, you close your tank, you take it apart, and then you shake it. You shake it vigorously. And what happens is there's a temperature range on here, like a thermometer, and this gauge will rise as you shake it. Because as you're shaking it, what you're doing is you're shaking all the CO2 out of solution. So you're degassing, decarbonating the liquid. Well, what happens is the pressure has to go somewhere. So the pressure builds inside this as the CO2 releases. And this gauge kind of goes up. You look at the gauge, you look at the temperature. There's a chart that I'll show on the next page. It says here, after filling the device, force out the solution. Using the dissolved CO2 chart, cross-reference the temperature of the beer and the pressure on the ZOM. Look at your temperature, look at your pressure. Then you look at this chart. This chart will tell you what your CO2 levels are. For example, if I am shaking my ZOM and it is at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and I get a reading of 11, that is, I can't really see it, 2.63 volumes. So I know exactly what the CO2 is. If I need a little bit more, turn the CO2 back on. If I'm good there, ready to go, ready to package. ZOM also provides this guy, which is pretty sweet. It's basically a carbonation tester for cans or bottles. It punctures the seal and tests the pressure and temperature of the packaged product. So it inserts basically itself into the product itself. You can tell what your CO2 levels are inside your package. And I think that is it, guys, for packaging. If you have any questions, please email me, and hope it's going well. Thanks.